one of the great collections within the National Gallery of Art is the French painting collection, which began in a rather modest way, but then developed with the additions of works from the Widener collection, with the addition of works from the Mellon collection. And a central part of it is Chester Dale, who is one of the trustees and who gave his collection of 250 plus French paintings to us back in 1963, in the bequest of 1963. We have a variety of different types of painting and sculpture and prints and tapestries, but I'm going to concentrate today on the painting collection. And although the 19th century is the strongest part of that collection, in fact, there are some very important earlier works that are in the Baroque section. So here on the slide, I'm just showing you a view through the doorway to see the great Monet, old musician, which was in fact a Chester Dale gift to us, and perhaps the most expensive painting that he ever purchased back when it was available in the early part of the 1930s. But we have to acknowledge that there are also works by Clouet and Philippe de Champagne, as well as this magnificent example of Georges de la Tour, the Repentant Magdalene, this very dramatic image using this chiaroscuro. The Caravaggio had really pioneered based on his understanding of the Venetian lighting and drama, and using this dramatic lighting to set off not only her gazing into the mirror, but with her hand on the skull, the symbol of the transience of earthly life, as the candle, which is hidden from us, illuminates it from the other side. We get to see the skull from both the front and the back. And when you stand in front of this painting, it is an absorbing experience into the kind of meditation, the kind of contemplation that this young woman is going through at this moment. So we have to go back before the 19th century, but it is the 19th century that's really the strength of the collection. And that begins with one of the great neoclassical paintings that is in America. And it is this portrait of Napoleon by Jacques Louis David. David was the court painter to Napoleon. We have the idea that he was very useful in disseminating information and I would say propaganda about Napoleon. And that's included in this painting, which dates to 1812, 1813. If you were in front of the painting, you would see that he is in fact not only life-size, but he is larger than life-size. And he's about 5'8" in the painting, and that will give you an indication of the scale of this painting. That's being given added weight by the fact that there are very strong verticals on either side of him, elongating him, making him seem taller. To the left side, what you can see through the doorway into the next room is the map room, and it's there to acknowledge Napoleon's prowess in war, is often attributed to his knowledge of topography, and then a pilaster, an engaged column as part of the wall, and then over here on the right side, this clock. And these very strong verticals allow us to read him as really this larger than life individual. It's a painting that's not just a likeness. When we think of portraiture, we tend to think in terms of likeness, but most portraiture through the history of Western European art had to do with status. And so we are meant to understand, to read the painting. So first we see him as a great military leader. He's in a special military outfit that was only worn on particular occasions. He has the decorations, some of which he developed himself. He has a sword on the chair. There's a battle map down on the ground. So at first we think of him in terms of being a very strong military leader. But he's in his office, he's at his desk in the Tuileries Palace, in the study. And so what we're meant to read is that he's just pulled back from this table in this chair. You'll notice the chair wouldn't really fit under the table. It's been brought from another room. And that he's been working on this piece of paper. And the piece of paper says COD. And so we're meant to understand that he's been working on these papers and that it's late at night because, as you notice, he has a bit of 5 o'clock shadow. One of the buttons on his cuff has come unbuttoned. That the clock says it's around 4:15, but combining that with the lamp and the candles on the left that are burned very low, he has literally been burning the midnight oil, that it's 4 in the morning. And he's been working on what? He's been working on the COD, you can see it again down here in the detail, which was the Code de Napoleon, the codification of French law throughout the empire. And for Napoleon, this was his most important civil achievement. So we see him as a great military leader, and we see him as a great civil leader. Everything in the painting contributes. The chair is decorated with bees. These are symbols of Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire. There are N's on the chair for Napoleon. And if we look down to the lower left, what we find is that not only do we have the sword, but we have a battle map, which has been unscrolled. It is where the artist signed and dated the painting. And it is next to 2 other objects that we need to understand. And the first is a French edition of Plutarch, the lives of the great ancient statesmen and generals. So he puts himself in that line. And then this Egyptian motif. And the Egyptian motif alludes to the Egyptian campaigns. They weren't terribly successful, but people were aware of them. So all of this comes together to show us what is essentially propaganda. It is a way of Napoleon and of Jacques-Louis David promoting certain aspects of his leadership. While the neoclassical section is not very large, there is a substantial section now, particularly with the acquisition of the Corcoran Gallery of Art. There is a very good romantic section, which has a number of works, some of which have not often been displayed. This is a small work by Corot. It's one of the few works that he did in Rome, 1825-26. It is of the Tiber River. We are in fact down along the banks of the Tiber. It is the Isola San Bartolomeo, the island of San Bartolomeo, which is the oldest inhabited part of Rome. And it sits between a Roman bridge over here and then the later bridge that you see over here. What Corot has done is to eliminate all of those sharp contrasts that we saw, for instance, in the Georges de la Tour, and modify this so that we have a gentle changing of tone without too much detail, so that he doesn't put in every brick, he doesn't put in every stone. Instead, we get the general geometric shapes of the hospital on this island. And then he allows the sky to be picked up in the reflections down on the water, as well as the buildings to be picked up in these same reflections. It is a gentle, harmonious work, and it was one of the great small acquisitions of the late Philip Conisbee, one of the French curators that helped to define the National Gallery's collection. And while Corot is an interesting artist, he doesn't necessarily fit that well into Romanticism. And to talk about late Romanticism is then to segue into the work of Courbet. Courbet is perhaps best known as a figural painter, and we'll get to that in a moment. But he was also very adept at trying to ascertain the specifics of weather conditions, particularly along his beloved Normandy coast. And so this was an acquisition by our present curator, Mary Morton, that shows this turbulent storm and sky above the water looking out across the channel from Normandy. Courbet, again, is better known perhaps for his figural work, which we'll see, but we can see in a work such as this that Courbet had a startling influence in realism on Monet and his friend Boudin. And so here we have a beach scene in Normandy with a few boats pulled up onto the sand, and a sailboat out there on the water, the cliffs over to the right, and then still a very active and interesting sky. If you compare this Courbet, which in fact is from the early 1870s, with this Monet, which we were given as a gift for the 50th anniversary of the National Gallery, you can see the relationship. Courbet towered over a period. He was from the Franche-Comté region of France that is over toward the Swiss-German border. We know that it is an area where candor is prized, where people are outspoken, where they have very strong opinions. And so when Courbet comes to Paris, he finds it effete and over-sophisticated and imposes his own idea on realism on the young generation of artists, the younger generation of artists. And so we know that it is Courbet in figural work such as this woman reading that goes for an earthier approach where the figures themselves are not always idealized, where there are no biblical or mythological scenes, no historical scenes. And in fact, what Courbet said was, I would be very happy to paint an angel if somebody would just bring one to the studio. But if you can't see an angel, you shouldn't paint one. You should paint your own time. How do we know what people look like, how they dressed, their surroundings in biblical times? You should be of your own time. You should look to the contemporary world. And his contemporary world was based first on the village life in Ornat, in the Franche-Comté, or he was interested in the seamier side of everyday life in Paris. Painting such as this is not entirely painted with brushes. You can see if you look at the brush strokes here, and the very heavy application of paint down here, that in fact he often used a palette knife, a kind of spatula, and literally sculpted the paint, partly because he wanted to emphasize the personality of the artist. He didn't want that impersonal glaze, that very perfect surface where none of the brush strokes could be seen. And this also has an immense influence on the brushwork and the bravura talents of the Impressionists. So you look at a painting like this in the National Gallery, and almost next to it is this painting, which is actually by Renoir. And it is not your typical Renoir, which we associate with the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. Those large, pleasant, plump figures in pink. Here, this is a painting called Diana, and he's clearly very much under the influence of Courbet. So it's a goddess, but what makes her a goddess? Certainly she isn't idealized. She holds a bow and a deer at her feet, so she is the goddess of the hunt, but it's clearly his model sitting on a rock out in the landscape. And as you look at it, once again, I will tell you that large parts of it down here in the rocks and in the background are painted with a palette knife. Moreover, Courbet ignored the use of the bright colors and very rich color that often academic painters use. And so there is just a little bit of blue here in the background and a little bit of red on the strap that goes with the quiver over here. Again, that marks her out as Diana. These paintings were submitted to the Salon. The Salon was the final arbiter of taste through much of French history in the 18th and 19th century. It was an annual show, generally in May. Artists submitted their work, and a jury of rather conservative men, sometimes academicians, sometimes government appointees, selected the work to be shown. Because it was conservative academicians, they were looking for students who represented the ideas that they had promoted. And so it was self-perpetuatingly conservative. But in order to make a living, you had to show at the salon. No dealer would carry your work. Few people would buy your work. And so Renoir takes this painting, which is really of a nude in the landscape, and he calls it Diana because contemporary nudity would have been verboten at the salon, completely forbidden. Only in the context of a historical or narrative scene was it appropriate. And so in this case, we know that he called it Diana. The jurors clearly saw through this. They didn't have to write why they turned it down. All they had to do is refuser, to refuse the painting. We can see the echoes of Courbet's work on his friend and colleague Whistler, the American who was trained in Paris. We can see that in this painting, Symphony in White, #1, of his mistress, Jo, modeling for him, where she is standing in front of a white curtain, wearing white, holding a white flower, standing on a white rug on a blue and white carpet. And it is also heavily painted. It is Whistler at his Courbet-esque, most Courbet-esque. So we can see that quite readily. Now, Whistler liked to talk back when the critics wrote about him. One critic wrote about his Symphony in White. How could it be a symphony in white? There's blue and yellow and purple. And Whistler responded famously, would the critic go to a symphony in F and expect all of the notes to be F, 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 fool? And so the beginnings of his dialogue with critics for some 30 years begins really with these paintings. Or we look at this painting, which unexpectedly is by Cezanne, the young Cezanne who had gone to Paris, whose father wanted him to be either a doctor or a lawyer, but who insisted on being part of the avant-garde in painting. His father, a nouveau riche banker who had started by making hats and then owning the hat factory, then buying the local bank and a huge estate down in Aix-en-Provence. His father refused to give him money, but he agreed to sit for him. And in this case, his father is sitting in this overstuffed chair, which we know Cezanne changed in size from painting to painting. They're in a room in the family estate. Behind his father, there's a painting on the wall, a painting that is representing a real painting that Cezanne did, but would never have been hanging in the house. His father, who was an industrious man, conservative industrious man, agreed to sit, but only if he could read while he was sitting. He wasn't just going to pose. So his father would have been reading Le Siècle, the Century, the conservative newspaper. And in fact, if we look very closely and use X-rays, we would find that it says Le Siècle under the present word. The title here is L'Événement. And L'Événement, meaning the happening, the event, was a weekly newspaper. Think City Paper, or at best, Rolling Stone. His father wouldn't have been caught dead reading that newspaper. But there is a reason for this. And that is that in this issue, at this time, the childhood friend of Paul Cézanne, Émile Zola, had written an article about how important Manet and his circle were going to be, that they were already cutting a swath through Parisian avant-garde art circles. And so what he's done is to put the evidence of his success, because he's part of that circle, in his father's hands, sandwiching him in between the newspaper and the painting behind. Now, one of the amazing things about this particular painting is it is entirely done with a palette knife, except for the lettering, which is then painted with a brush. No one painted a work of this scale, again, he's life size, using a palette brush. It was obsessive. And it is Cezanne looking to Courbet and taking Courbet's technique of juxtaposing heavy paint with brushes and with palette knives of juxtaposing the two. And certainly, if we're going to talk about Courbet's influence, we have to talk about one of the great collections in the National Gallery, and that is the collection of Manet's work. And here we have the Old Musician. Again, all of the figures are more or less life-size. It is a kind of collage technique that Manet sometimes used. He plucked figures from various different sources and put them together to have a kind of rebus-like puzzle that one had to decipher to really get its meaning. So we know, for instance, that the Old Musician here was a gypsy who lived in his neighborhood, but he didn't actually play the violin, played the small piano. However, piano is not a symbol of gypsies, the violin is. So he puts this figure in, and he puts him in the same pose as a Roman philosopher statue that was in the Louvre. So people would associate this itinerant figure with itinerant philosophy. Beyond him, an absinthe drinker, which makes note of Manet's first salon success. He did this individual figure of the absinthe drinker. Then over here to the far right, you get this figure that is also just out of view if I'm on your screen, but there is a figure of the wandering Jew of the Middle Ages taken from older sources, as the figure over here is meant to be a gypsy, and this is derived from a contemporary article about gypsies stealing babies, and you can see her bare feet and her gypsy skirt. And then these two figures, including his fiance's son, and a second figure, often in the studio, dressed in this odd costume. What kind of costume is that? It is the costume of a figure from the Commedia dell'arte. Pardon me, from the Commedia dell'arte, a figure that's often estranged from the company. So what do we have here in this fairly barren landscape on the edge of Paris? We have the displaced of Manet's time, with the cutting through the new boulevards and the great building program under Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann. There were more street people than there had ever been before. And so Manet suggests the kinds of individuals that you might find on the street. However, because he plucked them from a number of different places, you can see he's had a little bit of a problem with scale. If we brought everyone forward to the same place, some figures would be too large, others might be a little too small. The palette is that restrained palette of grays and blacks and browns that Courbet used. There is very obvious brushwork throughout, and it's a scene of everyday life. It is a realist image, not, even though we think of Manet as the godfather of Impressionism, it is not at all an Impressionist image. We're blessed to have this painting in the collection as well. We have two paintings from 1873 by Manet that tell a lovely story about not only Manet, but about the time in which he painted and the place in which he painted. This is a scene called The Ball at the Opera. But as you look around, that title is deceptive, because if it was a costume ball, we would expect everyone to be in costume. Instead, there are just a number of women who are dressed in bright costume. So we have to go back and rethink what this might be. In fact, we know we're in the lobby of the Opera House, not where a dance takes place, a ball. We're in the lobby of the Opera House, in the foyer of the old, intimate Opera House on the Rue Le Pelletier. And it must be during an intermission or after a performance has ended. The 6 women are with 30 men. Many of the men are identifiable. The composer, Chabrier, over here with the beard, the taller man, Theodore Duret, the first writer on Impressionism, the painter Guillaumin, and all the way over here, Manet, with his brown beard, looking straight out at us. And if we couldn't identify it as Manet, he gives us help. And ball and dance card over here, he signs and dates the painting. Well, let's go back for a moment. what are the women doing? It's clear that this isn't a dance. This woman has her arms around this man. She still has her domino, her mask on. This woman has dropped her domino. She has one hand around a man's waist, the other on his chest. These two women have already put on their capes. They have gifts in their hands. They've accepted flowers and orange and a scroll from these two men. They're leaving, but nobody else is, so perhaps the events aren't over. The woman over here strokes this man's cheek. And finally, the woman over here perhaps gives the game away. If we look at the man, we can see, in fact, that he's not standing, that he is sitting on a partition. See that? And that these are his slacks, and this little bit of color are the bottoms of his leather shoes. So he's seated, and this woman leans into his lap, her elbow in an intimate place, and she covers that up with the fan. So what is going on here? This is a scene of prostitution, of courtesans, legal if immoral, according to the times, but it's where upper class, higher class prostitutes went to find the men, their clients for the evening. Monet does a wonderful job of giving us this sense of all these men standing around of these women, but there's even more. It looks as if this might have been cut out of a larger painting, but it has not. In fact, if we look up here, we can see that there is another balcony, and we can understand that these are two more of these courtesans who are looking for fares for the evening. And in fact, if we look at these two legs, they're on our side of the balustrade. You can imagine this particular courtesan leaning over, trying to attract attention, perhaps kicking so that the men below know that they're up here. Linda Nochlin, a brilliant art historian, wrote about this painting that this forms a kind of signpost for what the men below are interested in, that this is a scene of sexual commerce, that they're not interested in these women for their intellect or personality, they are interested in them for their limbs and their torso and for their bodies. And it functions in that way. And Manet must have been very, very aware of this. And here we can see details of something. The woman over here with her arm extended toward Doré, the woman here with her hand on the man's chest, and the hand here perhaps even going for his wallet. Or here, the two women who are readily going off with the two men and the gifts in their arms. And over here, of course, Manet. And Manet is the realist. You'll notice that Manet is not engaged in this activity. The job of the realist is neither to condemn nor condone, simply to record. So he's recording what's going on. One figure we haven't mentioned is this figure. This clown figure. And as you look at that clown figure, there are the details that we've discussed. As you look at this clown figure, you can see he has his hand up. He's trying to get people to stop. This, in fact, painted in 1873 after the Franco-Prussian War, is a lampoon of Marshal MacMahon, who sometimes appeared in the newspapers in a clown outfit, who was the leader of France after the defeat to the Prussians, and who suggested that the defeat had nothing to do with military unpreparedness. He suggested that it had to do with low morality. If you look in the painting, you'll see nobody is paying any attention to it. And in fact, nobody paid attention to him at the time. Manet did this painting, The Railway, the very same year, where this painting was rejected by the Salon. This painting was accepted. It wasn't well shown. They put it high above the ground so people couldn't see it, but at least it was acceptable. It seems to be a slice of life, rather casually posed. Little girl looking out over railway tracks by the Pont Europe with perhaps her mother. We know it's Manet's favorite model. and he used her 9 separate times, Victorine Moron, who went on to become a painter in her own right. As you look at them, it looks to be casual, but in fact, it's a very careful calculation. Not only does the fence provide structure, architecture for the scene, but Manet has drawn opposites that then magnetically pull the painting together, which is to say, one is older, and to contrast, one that is younger. One faces toward us and one faces away. One has their brown hair up, the other their brown hair down. One is wearing blue with white highlights, the other white with blue highlights. So it's all very carefully put together. And then there's another very clever element here in this arm, which critics said lacked any anatomical veracity. The child points up to this window, doorway, and this window together. In fact, the conceit is that this was painted on the spot. It wasn't painted on the spot. It was painted in Manet's new studio, and this is the door to the new studio and the windows. So she actually gives it away. Now, what I want you to notice here is it's a brilliantly executed painting. It is carefully coordinated. But when we talk about the 70s, we usually talk about Impressionism, and that here Manet, in fact, shows very little interest in atmosphere. The Impressionist program was very much about the idea of the exactitude of showing the time of day, the time of year, and the weather conditions, the actual condition of the light when the painting was done. Program included having to paint that fairly quickly. Manet is not interested in any of those. You couldn't answer those questions here. In the painting that now hangs next to it by Manet's most important pupil, Eva Gonzalez, we see a riff on that painting where Gonzalez has used the standing child and the seated woman, one facing toward us, one facing away, the trellis-like work on this gate as opposed to the fencing that we saw the railroad. But look at how Eva Gonzalez is a full-fledged Impressionist. This was painted out of doors, and she's clearly very concerned with the specifics of light at the moment that it was painted, not with studio light. And the gallery waited a long time before adding a work by Eva Gonzalez, and this is one of her great works and an excellent example. And to drive home this point, I put the two on the screen together. And so you can see the difference between the sense of atmosphere in the Gonzalez and the more studio light of the Manet on the upper left. Eva Gonzalez was not perhaps the most prominent of the women working with Impressionism. That would have been Berthe Morisot, Manet's good friend. And what we have here is a picture by her from 1870, a painting that shows the mother and sister, Edma, of the artist. In fact, it's a painting that skillfully disguises the fact that Edma is 8 months pregnant at the time that the painting is done. Morisot was having a little trouble with the painting on the day it was meant to be sent to the Salon jury. Manet was visiting, and Manet picked up a brush in order to dab a little and help her. Unfortunately, he got carried away, and we know this from a letter that Berthe sent to her mother, that he picked up the brush and, like a madman, repainted the hands, the book, much of the dress, and perhaps the lilacs that are over here. She couldn't stop the painting being taken off to the Salon, and it is in the listing of the 1870 Salon, but nobody mentioned it. We think that perhaps she even had it pulled out of the exhibition before it could be shown because she was so antagonized by Manet having taken over the painting. We have a series of good paintings by Morisot, who was sufficiently affluent that she didn't have to sell her paintings. Many are still in the family today, passed down by generation. Here is her sister Edma again in the harbor at Lorient, where Edma sits here giving us a little bit of sense of scale, but not really portrait-like. It's not detailed enough, because Marceau, familiar with lenses, understood that if you focused on the detail of the rigging and the buildings in the distance, necessarily the wall and Edma would be slightly out of focus. And so we have this, which was probably one of the paintings in the first Impressionist exhibition of 1874. Degas was the motivator in many ways behind the early Impressionist exhibitions. We have a strong collection of Degas from this early self-portrait when he's in his early 20s to two of these long scroll-like ballet paintings with these plunging perspectives that take us back into the background. He loved images of ballerinas. He felt akin to them. He felt that they worked very hard, very long hours in order to seem effortless. And he equated that with his own work, that he worked hard doing drawings and doing paintings in order for his own work also to seem effortless. And so he returns time and again. He was fond of Japanese art, and this is part of the reason for these scroll-like images. And later in his career, he would return to this subject time and again. Here, the so-called four dancers, but in fact, probably not four dancers. We know that Degas was interested in photography and had works by Muybridge. And this is probably meant to be one dancer in four different attitudes behind a flat with the stage scenery out here. By this time, Degas was suffering from early onset blindness, damage to his sensitive eyes. And you can see that not all of the contour lines actually follow along the arms and along the dresses. And he's using his fingers almost as much as a brush to paint in the skirts and the bodices of these figures. Degas was very important and the closest friend of Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt has the honor of being the only American ever to show in the 8 pioneering Impressionist shows. And this is the painting that she did that really captured people's attention. It is called Little Girl in a Blue Armchair. Cassatt, despite the fact that she never married and never had children, had a special affinity, a special feeling for young children and for babies. And so she has this young girl pose on this overstuffed chair, and she too had a little difficulty with this painting. The child was restless. Her dog was generally with her while she painted, and she had some difficulty with this part of the floor and with this back corner. And originally she had painted a straight line across here. She asked, unlike Marceau, she asked her friend Degas for help. And it is Degas who painted in this gray flat area and who peaked this corner, which gives a sense of depth to the image. Originally, you'll see it's a little bit muddy over here. The dog was here on the floor, but she painted the dog out and she put the dog, Batty, her Belgian Griffin, she put the dog here as a kind of counterpoint to the little girl. Now, when we look at the little girl, we think at first, okay, she's unhappy, she's restless, she has on this nice tartan around the waist. But in fact, the longer we dwell on the outfit, we can see that this is not a tartan around her waist. This is her skirt. She has worked it all the way up around her waist in a rather unladylike way. Cassatt's brushwork, bravura, obvious brushwork is seen throughout the chairs and contrasted with the more careful brushwork that she used to delineate the child and her outfit. Cassatt had a long and productive career. She was at first among the Impressionists. Her art developed further into a kind of post-Impressionist phase, building on the freedom of the Impressionists to show without a jury, building on their freedom to use very rapid bravura brushwork. She then moved into a phase that was partly developed as a reaction to Japanese color woodblock prints with broad areas of solid tone that flatten the image. Here in the boating party of the early 1890s, a woman and child, and we're in the back of this boat, which is being rowed despite the bit of sail that you see over here. And you can see how she calls our attention to the center of the painting in numerous different ways. So as you look at it, notice this foreshortened arm as it comes down here, pointing to the baby, the truncated oar coming down here, pointing to the baby, the sail, which gives us this arrow-like indication of the baby, and then the baby itself, which is the only hot color in the painting. The blues and greens are recessive colors, pinks and reds that emerge, and so everything's called to the baby. And this baby is the only place where there's a shadow in the painting as well. She's left behind the Impressionist concerns with the specificity of light and moved on now toward a greater interest in the formal flatness and qualities of paint. Renoir, I showed you the early Renoir before. Now in this Renoir, which takes place just after the Franco-Prussian War, we see the oldest bridge in Paris, but the most heavily trafficked in the 1870s. Some 30,000 people a day crossed this bridge of all different types. And Renoir set out to show this bridge as a thoroughfare, as if it might be one of the great boulevards that had been created in Paris. And he peoples it with a variety of types, nursemaids and children, working class, soldiers and policemen, the working fruit vendor, the boulevardier, the flaneur, the affluent citizen who spent his time on the streets and the cafes of Paris. Well, these people moved across this bridge very rapidly, so we know that Renoir sent his brother Edmond down into the street to ask questions, their time, directions, anything that slowed them down a little bit so that he could have a moment to actually describe them. He's here, but he's also here. He's in the painting twice. Now, Renoir, as opposed to Monet, fulfills the Impressionist idea of specificity. We know from the costumes, it's late spring, early summer. We know from the sky that it's a partly sunny, partly cloudy day. And we know from the shadows, which work more or less as the sundial, that the sun must be up here. And since we know that we're looking, we know that it must be about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. So all of this comes in Renoir's rendering of this scene. He also shows the bridge as a boulevard. This is all the water that we can see down over here, next to the bath establishment with the French tricolore, the French flag. We also know that as he thought about this scene, that he eliminated any effects of the Franco-Prussian War. There would still have been piles of rubble here in 1892, but he wanted to think of Paris as it had been in the 1860s before the war. Monet and Renoir were close friends, and we have a nice selection of Monet paintings, including the bridge at Argenteuil here, a seemingly unposed painting where he manages to use a number of different triangles, interlocking triangles, to compose the scene, including the bridge itself. Here we get vintage Monet, the reflections in the waters, short staccato brushstrokes that pick up the reflections of the sky, of the boats, of the buildings and trees on the far bank. A painting that was done fairly quickly in the matter of a few days. A painting such as this is called the Parasol, but in fact, It is his wife Camille and their son Jean, but he deliberately makes it less of a portrait than he could have by placing the sun behind her, so that we're looking into the sun, her shadow comes toward us. He gives the effect, the impression of a breezy day. You can see that in the grass and you can see it in the clouds. He could have defined the flowers and weeds better, but he's not a botanist. He wants to give you the effect of being outdoors on a spring day with the breeze blowing across and the parasol shielding Camille from the sun. Look at the sky up in this region. If you just took a reproduction and extracted a square right here and looked at it, you would see that it is all but abstract, that we're moving in the direction of non-representational painting, even here in the mid-1870s. We have a strong collection of late Monet as well. We're fortunate to have not only these three paintings, but a pastel that show that he wanted to do the same image under different lighting conditions to show that it is the light that's the subject and not the architecture beneath. So we see Waterloo Bridge in London. These are all from 1903. And we see Waterloo Bridge as it's in an overcast day on the right, a day of pollution, an early morning light on the lower left. We see him, and he often worked in series of 20, 25, 30 paintings and would change them as the lighting and weather conditions changed and work on different ones at a different time. He sometimes went back in and touched them up afterwards so that they were more distinctive, but for the most part, they're done while he's looking at the subject itself. So we talked about Cassatt and that last Monet, which are breaking into the area of post-impressionism. Nobody ever thought of themselves as a post-impressionist. This is a term that Roger Fry coined in 1910 because he had nothing else to pull together Gauguin, Van Gogh, Toulouse-Lautrec, Georges Seurat, and Paul Cezanne. So he called them post-impressionists. Today, we understand that this indicates that they've moved beyond the interest in the transience of light and to greater structure in one form or another. This painting by Gauguin out in Brittany takes you a little while before you recognize the cow down here at the lower right against some reddish shrub, and the other two cows cut off by the frame on either side. This interest in both the cropping of photography and the cropping that came in Japanese color woodblock prints. And then the lack of Western perspective, that it seems a very shallow space, if there's any space at all. Instead, it exists in two dimensions on the surface with decorative patterns and colors. And only because our eye has been trained to look for depth do we get the sense that there is distance here. And this is certainly true of the painting he did in 1889 when he was out in Brittany, a group of artists, and decorating the main room of the inn of Marie Henri. And in exchange, he got to stay there. This was a cabinet door that then held a self-portrait, a portrait of a friend for the next cabinet door, a cabinet door that showed his face slightly modeled in light and shadow, as if hovering against this red and yellow background, and suggesting that to have an artist in your society, you had to accept both the good and the bad, because he's both a prophet, the symbol of the halo here, and the serpent down here, he's both a prophet and a pariah. And we can see the allusion to the biblical text in the apples from the tree of knowledge as well. This stylized serpent is different from this stylized flower. And these bring us back to the expression, which is Gauguin, and quintessentially, it is a sneer. He looks out of the corner of his eyes at us, an expression that suggests suspicion and suggests a lack of respect for those looking at him, because after all, he was expecting that it would be poorer travelers that came to this inn. And he wants to say, I'm Gauguin, who are you to be judging me? And he writes the date down here in PGO, Paul Gauguin, but adding the O, pronouncing this, it turns into a vulgar expression used by sailors. It insults the viewer of the painting. Now, the painting is reminiscent of Van Gogh in part because it is based on this famous Van Gogh that Van Gogh did shortly after he lunged at Gauguin and cut off part of his ear to give to a prostitute and had fits that were related to epilepsy. But you can see where this is a haunting, self-serving image, self-searching image, where the orange and the red in the background meet precisely at the eye level of those green eyes and give us insight into the fact that this is a figure who is searching, who is in crisis, as opposed to the outward gaze of Gauguin in his self-portrait done a few months later. This is the only painting that I'm showing you that is not in the gallery's collection. It was sold not long ago. It's in a private collection. Gauguin is represented in the gallery's collection also by some of the paintings from Tahiti, including Fatata Tiniti. And we could talk about some of the same abandonment of local color and representation. We could talk about the division by this tree limb where we don't see its origins, and the fact that the horizon is right off of the canvas so that we get an insistent two-dimensionality and flatness to this image. Over the years that I've been at the National Gallery, the Van Gogh collection has improved immensely. When I arrived back in the late 1970s, there were just a handful of paintings by Van Gogh, and most of them were not of the highest quality. Then John Hay Whitney gave us this self-portrait. It's a self-portrait that he does while recovering in San Reme. He writes to his brother about the portrait. They say it's not easy to know oneself. It is even more difficult to paint oneself. And so he paints this glare, this look of intensity, that apricot colored beard and hair played off against this imaginary blue background, which energizes the entire surface of the painting. No one before Van Gogh, except perhaps Rembrandt, his Dutch ancestor, in the sense of artistic ancestry, did as many self-portraits that searched human expression. We also acquired this from Walter Annenberg's gift. Walter Annenberg gave us one of the 6 images that he did of roses. Again, a very powerful example of Van Gogh's work from late in his career. More recently, we were the recipient, after the death of Bunny Mellon at the age of 104, Paul Mellon's wife, of the sketches that Seurat did. These are small cigar box lid size images of a whole series of sketches that he did in preparation for each of the large scale paintings. And Georges Seurat, one of the leading neo-impressionist, post-impressionist painters, went through a variety of different solutions before arriving. So we see here that for the bather at Asnières, he has a few figures on the shore, but the subject is really horses being washed out off of this suburban working class area of the Seine. And you can see the horses over here. And then he eliminates the horses over here in this study. Now he includes aspects of industrialization, chimneys, spewing pollution back here, the train as it crosses this bridge. But he's intent on developing this lovely still life of a few clothes that have been taken off. And all of these form part of the set that would lead to this painting from the National Gallery in London of the bathers as Asnières. And you can see that the solution is very different from those first sketches. This is done in the Tillist technique of applying dots of paint using divisionism, dividing color into its primary aspects, and applying them in different densities throughout the scene. very strong horizontals, train bridge in the background, very strong verticals, figures that you see. Notice that you don't see any of the figures from the front. We have other paintings by him. This delightful small painting, which also just came to us from the Melons, and the image that you see here, the garden with the watering can in the foreground. Quite small image, not much bigger than you see on the screen, but carefully arranged so that we get the path and the shadow and the light in the dark. And we have a number of larger paintings, not among the 7 largest, but a number of larger paintings, including this image of lighthouse on the floor, which is in the full-fledged neo-impressionist pointillist technique. We have more Cezanne, not just early portrait of his father, but we have a number of figural scenes, such as the still life with the peppermint bottle, where Cezanne begins to present the point of view so that we see some items from above, some from beyond. Or the image, and from Paul Mellon, of the boy in the red vest. And eventually we enter into the 20th century with this painting by Picasso of the Saltimbanque in 1905, but that's the story for another day. I am happy to answer questions if you want to ask by way of the chat. And I'm happy to go down, let's see, and stop the share. I see questions they have chat room.
Yes, if anyone has questions, you can put it in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll give that a minute, but in the meantime, I want to say thank you, Eric. That was such a wonderful way to kick off the afternoon. Be transported to 19th century France.
You're very welcome. Is for this vulgar term, I won't go on, but it has to do with a part of the male anatomy. Then it's an expression used by sailors, which is my favorite. In fact, the very first painting I ever wrote on when I was at the National Gallery was the image of the ball at the opera. And I've gone back to it time again and again, and I've learned a lot about it. And in fact, I have a for it that has not yet really been discussed. And it's a great favorite of mine because of all the encoded meanings in it. In fact, the National Gallery has reopened. The sculpture garden had been open for months. The West Building opened 3 weeks ago. And I have just heard from the director today that the East Building will reopen within the next 2 weeks. So all 3 of those will be open. There are timed passes that you have to get. You can go on the website to the nga.gov site, and you can actually find all of the information there. I'm sorry, I don't recall saying the Nat Gallery sold the painting. That is, it's not considered part of our charter. We're allowed to once it's here, or for that matter, tapestries, sculpture, there is one provision where we're allowed to trade for prints for a better impression. Lessing Rosenwald included that in his bequest, but otherwise we have to stay with the original collection. So if I said that the National Gallery sold the painting, I must have misspoken. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and thank you very much to Eric. If there are continued questions, please feel free to send them to alumni@dickinson.edu, and we can share them with Eric if you have other questions. And we will look forward to being able to visit the National Gallery of Art again one of these days, once we can do so safely as a group again. So, or as Eric said, take the opportunity to get one of those timed passes and enjoy experiencing art in person again. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Eric, you look like you want to say something.
I just look forward to us gallery again. Some of the upcomes. We have an exhibition of Carpaccio. We have an exhibition of the Splendor of Genoese. And we have a whole series of contemporary exhibitions that will open in the East Building. So I'm hoping we can all be together again in the autumn or in the winter or the spring.
Well, Eric, you'll be hearing from me shortly about that. That sounds wonderful. So thank you all very much. I hope to see you at another one of our events throughout the course of this week, and we look forward to celebrating with you all soon. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.